Hey, welcome back to the DCB Variety Hour. In my last video, I showed you how I weathered my 3D printed life-size IG-11 droid, and he turned out so well that I decided to create an entire Mandalorian themed backdrop so I could properly display him in my vintage store. So the next piece I decided to work on was a Stormtrooper helmet on a stake. In this video, I'll show you each step I took to recreate it. The first thing I needed was a somewhat decent looking helmet that wasn't going to set me back several $100s. So I found this one on eBay for 55 that looked good enough for my needs. And unfortunately, it's from China, which, is troublesome in its own way, but sometimes it's the best and only option without spending a ton of money. It took about a month to arrive, but now I have it, so let's take a look. The helmet appears to be made out of a thick poured plastic, maybe latex. I don't know, but it's sturdy enough so it doesn't warp like most of those cheap Halloween costume helmets do. The shape isn't 100% accurate, and it has some details that hardcore Star Wars nerds like myself can totally point out. But for the most part, it'll be good enough for the general public. I decided to put him on an 8-foot long stake, so I purchased a 2x2 piece of lumber. To make it easier to work with in my cramped little space, I cut off the top 13 inches in order to make the spike. I just penciled in a line from the center top to the bottom corners on each side and then ran those through my table saw. This open blade probably isn't the safest method, but it's what I have to work with and I'm pretty careful. So kids and, some dumb adults like me, please don't try this at home. After each side is cut, I'm left with a really nice and sharp spike that I actually ended up poking myself pretty bad with. Next, I'm going to mark off where I want the stake to come out of the back of the helmet. This material cuts really easily with a Dremel cutoff wheel, and I'm probably breathing in SARS, but whatever. Now I'm going to mark off some crack lines, and again, using my cutoff wheel, I simply, cut through the plastic in like a jaggedy sort of fashion. I repeat the process for the crack in the front of the helmet, cutting all the way through in a craggy sort of pattern. Afterwards, I'll use a sharp X-Acto blade to cut out the melted pieces of plastic around the edges. To start weathering the helmet, I'm going to use the Woodland Scenic Earth Color liquid pigments that I mentioned in the last video. They're a little different than paint as they have a kind of a dusty feel to them once they're dry. The colors I'm going to use are yellow ochre, burnt umber, and stone gray. I have black as well, but I'm probably not going to be using that for this project. I'm going to start with the lighter color, the yellow ochre, to begin with. Simply brush an area with the pigment, making sure to pay extra attention to get it, deep into the crevices. After a few seconds, just wipe it away with a rag. Repeat this process over and over until you build up your desired weathered look, and it's amazing how easy and effective this technique is at really aging and weathering a prop. The second color I used was the burnt umber, as you generally want to work lightest to darkest. This is the same process, brush it on, wipe it off. The way you work the rag also makes a huge difference in the effect. If you dab it, it leaves a more overall dirty look as opposed to wiping, which tends to only leave the paint more in the crevices than the flat surfaces. Now I'm going to use Fuller's Earth, which is a finely ground clay powder that's used in the cosmetic industries. I'm going to spray a small area with, your basic hairspray and then flick powders at it with a paintbrush. You can also lightly brush the area with your paintbrush full of powder as well. The color I'm using is sort of a light grayish tan. I also have a darker gray powder, which I might use sparingly. The final step in the weathering is to paint on the dark blood stain around the cracks. I'm just using red and black and brown acrylic paints. Nothing fancy there, just mixing them and dabbing them all around the area. I heavily watered down some of the red and let that run down the front of the mouth to look like a stain. After all the blood was painted on, I added some more of the Fuller's Earth powders on top of that to make it look like it's been there for a while. If there's too much shine to your paint job, you can dial it down a little bit by spritzing it with Tester's Dull Coat. That can also help lock in some of the loose powders too. Now I'm going to take the rest of the piece of lumber and cut off the rounded edges by running it through my table saw. Then I'll glue the spike back up on top. To give the wood a more metal-like texture and so you don't see all the wood grains, I'm going to coat the sides of it in a layer of Bondo. This stuff sets up really quick, so do it in small batches. After the Bondo's cured, I use a rasp-like file to smooth out any of the areas that are, too rough and bumpy. Next, I'm going to brush paint the entire piece with rust-oleum flat black enamel. After that layer dried, I lightly misted the entire surface with rust-oleum black knight metallic spray paint. I just bought this new bottle of Badger rust paint at the hobby store, and this will be my first time trying it out. Just like the woodland scenic paint, though, the process is exactly the same. Dab your brush in an area and wipe it off with a rag. Be sure to wipe in a downward motion, though, to represent the natural path that rust would take. The final touch is the ragged cloth that hangs down from the bottom of the helmet. For that, I'm using a simple cheesecloth. You can get, at any paint department of any hardware store. I'm using some liquid RIT dye in cocoa brown and some water and simply dipping the cloth into the mixture. If it's too light, you can add more dye. The cloth automatically got that matted look to it, but you can also, tug and pull and rip chunks of it to fit your desired look. I'm just going to use contact cement to attach it to the inside of the helmet, but you can pretty much use anything. Tape, glue, creamed corn, jello, taco sauce. And there you go. Pretty simple, yet I think pretty effective display piece. Probably cost me, I don't know, less than $100 total, and I still have lots of leftover paints to use, for other projects, and a half full can of hairspray to make me pretty.
You're weird.